Yo guys, I've got a spark which I'm going to use to ignite the fire for another annual tradition here on the channel. The style will be the same as years prior. I have portrait posters lined up in order for ranking, and I'll be recording this entire video in one take, so please pardon the lack of editing or any stutters, because doing one take videos even, they get quite hard. In fact, I've stuttered already, but this is just the usual style I like for larger ranking videos such as these. Despite the fact it's now April, I'm still going to be looking back to 2021, specifically all the films I saw theatrically, and we're going to rank them all. I feel like it's quite the achievement for me to have watched 72 films in a theatre in 2021, given that theatres over here in the UK were closed until May due to the rapid spread of the COVID pandemic. That brings us nicely onto the rules for the films that qualify here. Firstly, for release date for these films are UK based. So films which released in the US in 2020 but didn't get released here in the UK until 2021 will be counted here for the ranking. Likewise, films not due to release in the US until 2022 but got a 2021 UK release date will also be counted for the ranking here. Secondly, these films needed to have a theatrical release, so no straight to streaming films like Netflix originals, as they do not count. Finally, if I didn't see the film, it can't be on the list, so if there are any films which released theatrically in the UK in 2021 that aren't on the list, then I simply didn't watch them. Now, with all of that having been said, let's move on to the very bottom of the list. So coming in at number 72 is for Forever Purge. Now, just let it be known that my laptop is very excited for this ranking list, so if you hear any fans in the background, it would be that kind of overheating a little bit. It'll be fine, but what won't be fine is the experience watching this film. This is easily my least favourite film of 2021 because it takes such a cool concept. In fact, all of the Purge films are built on an interesting premise of no law being incorporated in society whatsoever, so you can get away with literal murder, and for Forever Purge expands upon that basic concept to ask, what if this lawless spree moved on from just 12 hours a year to continuous? What if there was a Forever Purge? Now, what let this down, because trust me, the concept is the beginning and the end of my praises for this film. Everything else was terrible. The pacing was slow, and the characters I hated, so naturally I kind of wanted them to die. I didn't want them to succeed, and it just takes no advantage of the setting neither. It just gives us a generic, crime film with slight mystery elements. So the fact that this is the same thing we've seen done time and time again, despite the concept, just makes it so dull. There's no style, there's no direction here. And ultimately, again, it's the fact that I hate these characters and don't want to see them succeed, and it's their uncompelling goals that makes this such a fall flat experience for me. Speaking of fall flat, we have Tom and Jerry, where Tom and Jerry themselves are animated in 2D and everything else is live action. A concept of which I'm already skeptical about, given that Tom and Jerry is such a beloved cartoon, and now it's barely even a cartoon anymore. This film is just surprisingly dull and boring. The comedy very rarely lands. The fact that there's any comedy at all is a miracle in of itself. And it just really betrays the original cartoon in the fact that it doesn't carry over that same amount of energy and style. And even then, those are perfect for little 15-minute increments, but to fill an entire 90 minutes with the same lackluster, fall flat type gags, it really does not work as a feature film. It's poor in execution, and I just really wish it was better for two beloved characters. Now moving on to number 70, we have Dear Evan Hansen, one of the worst musical films I've ever seen. Given that this is a musical, it's a shame how shit the audio mixing is. Man, I hated the audio editing in this because the music is too loud and the lyrics are too soft. You cannot hear what the songs are singing. That is the biggest insult. On top of that, you have some terrible performances even, some of the worst we've seen all year. For main flagship character, I can't even remember the actor's name, but he didn't do a good job convincing me that he was 14 when the actor himself is in his late 20s. So the film was horribly miscast. The songs just really didn't hit for me, and it's just trying to be something that is not. It tackles some deep and mature themes, and yet at the same time it doesn't do those themes justice. It doesn't look at mental health in a good enough fashion to really justify tackling it in the first place. It doesn't do anything new, that's for starters. The film isn't nearly as emotional as it needs to be. The main character is an arsehole and nobody points him out for it, so that takes away any sort of investment you can have in his character arc, making everything once again feel lackluster. Boy, I hate this film. Because normally I love it when they tackle deep and mature themes, and especially when it comes to the mental health of things, but again, this film just doesn't seem to understand those philosophies, and so it falls flat. Now, number 69, nice. But moving on, we have Escape Room Tournament of Champions, a sequel to another film I wasn't the largest fan of. Now, I love doing escape rooms in real life, but they don't make the most entertaining horror flicks, especially when this one is more focused on the twists of its overall narrative than it is the actual escape room and the traps themselves. Like, they had some creativity behind the actual rooms, and that, I guess, coupled with the tension, does elevate it slightly on this list. But once again, you just don't have characters that you wind up caring for even, so if they live or die, it makes no difference to you. It's just a film. They're not like real people, it's just actors putting on a role, and even then, like, you could probably care about them if they felt realistic or if they had some sort of hook to them that warranted your compassion towards them, and they have none of that because the writing is terrible. Again, the creativity behind rooms, only thing I like. The exposition and the twists, they are so poor in execution and pacing, so ultimately, once again, it becomes a bore fest, and that's quite surprising when half of the film is dedicated to really creative and tension building escape rooms, and the other half is dedicated to a story that you couldn't give two shits about. That's Escape Room 2 for you. A huge room of lost potential. Now, number 68 is going to be Clifford the Big Red Dog. I don't really remember growing up with the show all too much. I remember it being on television as part of like the background, but it's never something I really thoroughly invested all my time into when I was younger. And this film, even if I was younger and was fully invested in the character, I could not see myself enjoying it all too heavily. The CG is laughable, the acting is fine at best, I suppose, but again, CG is laughable. That's not the film's only flaws though. It's incredibly slow paced, which is a shame because normally like these films are really energetic, trying their hardest to keep the younger audience entertained for 90 minutes straight, and that's just the thing. It's not entertaining, and the story feels so bland and cookie cutter. They literally just took the template even of other better films, and they wrote like different character names in there. They put Clifford in there. They threw in a big CGI red dog. So naturally, this film does nothing special, nothing unique, and younger audiences deserve better. The younger audiences can have their brains stimulated in ways that we can never comprehend, and this film is not doing them any favours. Now, 67 is Earwig and the Witch, one of my only Studio Ghibli films, unfortunately. At least I hope it's Studio Ghibli. That being said, this is notoriously amongst the bottom of their films, and I can see why. Even though I have not watched many of the others, I could tell that they get better than this, because I like the animation style, I will give it that, but otherwise the main character is a little too bratty and I can't invest myself in her arc too much, and the film is too short, so it doesn't really have enough time to hone these characters and give them much depth, unfortunately. And all of the twists, they just felt real out of place almost. There was just two tones that didn't really mesh. You had for magical elements and for musical elements, and it just got a bit too offbeat for me. There was no rhythm to the dialogue neither. It just wasn't a film which sat well with me, and I found myself not enjoying it as much as I would have wanted to. Speaking of films I didn't enjoy, we have Boss Baby Family Business. My one and only praise for this film is that it even at the very minimum is better than the first, but that's still not saying much because the first two was unbearable. There was basically a gag in someone's mind, hey, what if we make Tina Fey and Alec Baldwin into babies? And that's what we have. We have Alec Baldwin as a baby. Yeah, the gags really fall flat. It's got an over-reliance on slapstick humour, which just really gets on your nerves after a while. This film is a lot more, well, I would say stylised. The first Boss Baby had some very stylised segments, but it got a bit too bombardment with the style because you had these fictional segments that took place in a character's head and then ones that were real, but sometimes it was hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. This film doesn't have that same problem, and naturally it's a lot more energetic, it's a lot more fast-paced, and for gags even, they are funnier. There's also a lot more heart in this film. There's an actual growth in the characters and the dynamic they have with one another, and yet still it falls flat with a terrible humour and just other underlying elements like the sound not being the utmost creative, because come on, this is a world of animation, you can do anything and all you do with it is make Alec Baldwin a baby. Oh yeah, and Tina Fey too, at least I think the other character is voiced by Tina Fey. You'd hope so now that I've referenced it multiple times. We're going to move on to 65 out of 50 before I embarrass myself further, and that's going to be Mortal Kombat, a film with some interesting action sequences and some over-the-top gore, which is actually more hilarious due to the actual ridiculousness behind the nature of these kills. Like there's one where the hat becomes a saw blade and he just chops a monster in two straight down it. It is so over the top. The CGI is awful and that just adds further to the laughs. Like yeah, the film is slow paced and gives us no characters to invest into whatsoever, and does nothing new, it does nothing groundbreaking, it's not going to win any Oscars, and it's not perfectly self-aware. It still takes itself a little bit too seriously for a Mortal Kombat film. And there are moments in the story where it does bring itself to an absolute crawl to try and deliver either fan service or action sequences that don't feel necessary to the building of a plot. So there's plenty of flaws here, but at the same time there's also fun to be had, and when it comes to video game adaptations, there's a lot worse that could have been done. Now moving on, we have another sequel, Don't Breathe 2. Really disappointed by this one because I love the first. It had some excellent tension. And in this one, they kind of try to make you sympathise with the blind man, and he is a bit of a hard ass, but this is more of an action horror than a thriller. So you still have the gore and you still have the hard ass moments, but ultimately it's the fact that I can't bring myself to sympathise with such a cold-hearted character. I can't find myself buying into the idea of him raising this child and ultimately sacrificing so much for her. There's just such a huge suspension of disbelief, and there's not enough character work here to justify it all, so naturally I would have preferred the film staying to its roots rather than doing so much different, because at the end of the day, this is why we go into sequels. We go into them wanting more of what we loved about the first, and you don't get it with this film. It's something entirely different. It might as well have been called something entirely different, because it's more so a spin-off than a sequel. And I just didn't wind up enjoying it. In fact, I wound up very disappointed. It's probably my most disappointing film of the year, given that I was really looking forward to it. Again, I really liked the first. I even saw this one with my mum, and she didn't enjoy it all much either. So, what does that have to say about Don't Breathe 2? Now, number 63 is Old. This, at the very minimum, is a better crafted film than the ones preceding it. It has a slightly better script. Keyword here is slightly. The script is still awful. The dialogue is jarring and unrealistic, and you just can't find yourself buying into these characters that seem so staged and ridiculous. The CGI is awful. You know, M. Night Shyamalan tends to be the master of twists, and the twists in this one just don't work for me. It's a film that's just kind of like lackluster in energy, and it's not fun to sit through neither. There's just no hook to it ultimately, and it really falls flat. It's a shame, because M. Night Shyamalan is one of those directors where he's made some absolutely incredible films, but as of late, his films have been awful, and this is no exception. Now, number 62 is Last Letter from Your Lover. This one has two different storylines running, not simultaneously, like they take place at different times, but throughout the narrative, you'll go into one timeline and then you'll go into another, and the way how it's structured and subsidized between the different timelines, it keeps the pacing moving forward, I suppose. But the problem here is that I don't find that the characters have much romantic chemistry. It feels jarring when they get together, and I'm not the largest fan of these characters. I'm a fan of the actors though, and that's the large disappointment. But above all, the fact that these plots don't really converge and come together until the very end. The lack of link between them just makes it all the more jarring when we're constantly switching between plots that feel as though they have nothing to do with one another. It becomes annoying and very dull and a drag on the pacing, should I say. Just all of the terrible D words they sub this film up great, and there's not even a D in the title. That's ironic. Now moving on to 61, we have Halloween Kills. Yet again, another big shame. Well, at least for people who aren't me, this was my first Halloween movie, which I suppose is the biggest shame of them all because I did not start at a good point. The ending twist didn't really work for me, and the fact that it took place all within the time span of a couple of hours meant that, well, there was multiple plot lines all happening at once, and they were just so uneven in terms of how invested I were with them. So whenever one would pop up, I'd want to go back to one I was most invested in. Characters just feel betrayed. There's characters who spend the entire film on a hospital bed. It just feels like such a dull and lackluster experience. There's just nothing to really, again, hook you with this film. It's just yet another sequel to capitalise on the brand name that does nothing unique or original with it. It's just running it by the books, as cookie cutter and generic as you get. But we're going to move on to number 16, Malignant. I'll give it credit, this one was easily one of the weirdest and most stylised horror films of the year, but that also made it one of the most jarring and unlikable, especially since it has a very acquired taste to it. And normally I'm a fan for weird, wacky and elevated horror, but this one just took twists and turns that I didn't find myself invested in. I just didn't really connect or resonate with this film. There was no substance there for me to look at, point at, dissect on a chopping room board and just say, I like that, because I didn't like it. And sometimes that's just how opinions fall, you know. At the end of the day, you're entitled to your own opinion, but in my opinion, not the largest fan of this film. 59 is going to be Space Jam: A New Legacy. I really hate how the basketballer cannot act. I apologise for not knowing his name. I want to say it's LeBron James, but I'm not an expert in any of this. This just goes to show for one, take notion of this all, but it's Looney Tunes characters, and you have a whole animated segment, but here's the thing, it's so jarring tonally because you don't really know who this film is for. It references things like Game of Thrones and Rick of Morty. Those are clearly things targeted towards an adult demographic, but the Looney Tunes basketball, for comedic style and for constant energy and pacing would imply that this is for a much younger audience. So how can you throw in gags for an older audience when so much of it is targeted towards younger ones? You could make the argument that this is so for parents remain entertained when they're taking their kids to see it. Well, nobody went to go see this film anyway because of the box office, but that's not a hindrance on the actual film itself. I just feel as though the pacing was so uneven. For act structure, you had, really short first and second acts, and then a really overly long third act. Like, the basketball game is for the last hour, and it doesn't need to be that long because it's bogged down and it drags with its pacing to focus instead on background characters that aren't even part of the plot. They're just there so you can say, I know that guy. Like the Iron Giant, it's called it the Iron Giant that's there, but he doesn't need to be there. There's no plot need for it. So just for blatant placement, this is basically, Warner Brothers trying to create a cinematic universe, I suppose. And say the basketball game, there just isn't enough interesting stuff happening. There's only so much you can do with a stylized basketball game, and even then, they didn't go for full 9 yards. They could have done so much more, because at the end of the day, this is a cartoon. There is no limitations except for your creativity. And what does that show about the production behind this film? It was lazy and uninspired. But now we move on to 58, which is Spirit Untamed. Talk about lazy and uninspired. First of all, this is a huge animation downgrade for DreamWorks. This feels like a straight-to-TV film, which it kind of is. It's both a sequel to the original Spirit as well as a prequel to the Netflix show. It's confusing like that. And as a sequel, it's incredibly disappointing because I watched Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron, or whatever it's called, and I watched it before going into this film, and I was very impressed. That film had just a lot of really mature themes, and it was really inspiring. This film is not. This poster is pretty cool. It's got a lot of colour behind it, and at the end of the day, the animation focuses on colour and making everything all cartoon-like, and there's no realism, which is fine, because again, it's a cartoon. But I just really wish there was more energy and expression, and just the models could have expressed themselves more, because they are basic models, again, with a clear budget restraints and all that. And it's just not a very investing story, because it's that same generic cookie cutter template I've mentioned time and time again. It has several cliches, and there's just no unique execution to the film neither. There is so much missing here, and despite its name, it's lacking in spirit. But 57 is going to be Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard. Easily my least favourite title of the year. It's terrible. Why would you have so many plurals in the same sentence? It's a grammatical nightmare is what it is, and it's a shame because there is some good chemistry here between Ryan Reynolds and Samuel L. Jackson, but there are subplots which the film diverges to, and you don't want any of that. You've paid to see Ryan Reynolds and Samuel L. Jackson, so show us Ryan Reynolds and Samuel L. Jackson, and it makes the film's pacing slow, dragged out. It feels so much more longer than it actually is, because it's surprisingly light on action. Like, the trailers give you all of the best gags and all the best action sequences, and even then, what was in the trailer wasn't even that good. So yeah, this film, massive letdown. It had a lot of potential given its star power, but ultimately it had a weak script, and the entirety of the production suffered for it. Now, moving on, we have Those Who Wish Me Dead. Now, this, I feel like I enjoyed more than most. I don't hear many good things about this film, and it's a shame because it's a solid thriller with Angelina Jolie in it, and several other actors, of course. You have Shane from Walking Dead and The Punisher in there too, the actor who plays him. And at the end of the day, it works very well as a thriller. It's 90 minutes of raw tension build-up, and you have characters that don't make stupid decisions, so you invest in them first and foremost. You don't find yourself yelling up the screen in frustration at them. You can tell from the poster that it's visually stunning, because the fire and the lighting they do with it all. The villains are just evil for the sake of being evil, and those are villains that we haven't seen too much in cinema recently, so it's a nice callback all at the same time. So it has your tension, it has your thrills, it has characters that you don't absolutely despise, and they make good enough decisions. Performances are about standard. You know, we've seen better from Angelina Jolie, unfortunately, but still, it could have been a bit shorter, and it could have been a little less depressing. Tonally, it feels as though some things come out of left field and things do escalate a bit too quickly, so naturally you're not given the kind of time, breathing room to soak it all in. The film certainly has its flaws, I'm not denying it that. For cinematography, whilst being fine, could have been better. It's just standard thriller type stuff, I suppose. And yes, there is very little to write here about in terms of direction. It's executed in the same style as any other thriller of its kind, so you could have literally brought in any cookie cutter director and they would have done it the exact same way. That is Those Who Wish Me Dead for you. But number 55 is Peter Rabbit 2, one film finally having a little bit of style to it, and that comes down to the structure mostly, but the voice acting is so shoehorned in and second-handed, you should say. These voice actors are just phoning it in, you can tell. And ultimately, the only character with development in this film is Peter Rabbit himself. All of the other characters get sidelined or just don't have any substance to them, and you have no reason to invest in them or care about them. And at the end of the day, Peter Rabbit is so naive in this film. You thought you'd have grown from the first one, but this is once again a little bit of backwards development, and so naturally, it's a frustrating watch, this one. It's not nearly as entertaining as it thinks it is. For lack of self-awareness, again, frustrating is the perfect word for it. So Peter Rabbit 2, the first one was fine, this one is also fine. I just think it could have been better, especially with a beloved character like Peter Rabbit, but I think they should have gotten better voice actors and better writers too, so that then the film could have been directed with more prowess. It could have had better dialogue rather than it being so on the nose. But now we're going to move on to number 54, Reminiscence, a sci-fi action flick starring Hugh Jackman and Michelle Pfeiffer. It's surprising that this film wound up as awful as it was. It was a massive flop at the box office despite its star power. And I think that's because the people who did go to see it didn't have anything good to say about it, so naturally the word of mouth would have people avoiding this film, and I couldn't blame them, to be frank. This is a slow-paced, slow burn type film which is very dull and uninteresting. It doesn't do a good job building up its world from scratch. You know, that's the thing, sci-fi films really need some sort of pre-existence world or some sort of source material. This might have had source material, which I'm not so sure on, and it even says on poster from the creators of Westworld, but here's the thing, it doesn't have that style, that oomph to it. And Reminiscence, you know, has multiple plot lines running, different timelines. It's kind of like a mystery film where the characters are catching back up on one another from past events, and so ultimately it doesn't culminate all too well, adding once again to just for lack of care put into writing and the plot. They should have done more to really iron things out and make this more of an investing plot and an investing setting with investing likeable characters in it, but everything falls flat because it's basic. The characters are basic with a lack of real character development, real tangible character development, because this is a sci-fi film for Pete's sake. They have technology in there that we can't relate to, so there's nothing to ironically reminisce with in Reminiscence. So yes, this film fell flat for me, and it's 54 because of it. Now 53, we're starting to move into more of the mediocre films. I didn't hate them, didn't like them either. And we start with Spiral Book of Saw. Now first of all, the pacing on this is perfect. I do think the traps though were a little lackluster and a little bit dull in comparison to other Saw films. They're just not nearly as creative. I did love Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson in the film though. They had some really great chemistry, and at the end of the day, like, for unraveling mystery of this cop and the kind of things he faces on a day-to-day basis, it's really great characterization, and it has some themes to it, there's no denying it that. So there is things to like about this film, even if it is just another run-of-the-mill Saw film with its basic execution that it's done film and film again, so naturally not going to get anything new, it's not going to win any Oscars, but it does its job well enough. Now 52 is Eternals. Boy, where do I even start with this film? They've given themselves 2.5 hours to tell an 8-hour story. This was so much more better when it was a series, because then in a series you could have an episode dedicated to each character, because the problem here is that this is the first MCU film with certain elements of it. It's the first one with like real depth and emotion, and yet those beats don't land because you aren't given nearly but enough time to invest and care about these characters. Why should I care if they live or die when I've known them for all of 2 minutes? And not to mention, it has several themes all running at the same time. Now, by far the best part of this film is the diversity. I love the range within the cast and their backgrounds and all that, and they all bring something to their roles, even if it's just, you know, checking off diversity boxes, I suppose. But the powers are unique and interesting, I suppose. And say, going back to the themes area, we have themes of being stuck in a child's body and not being able to mature and grow and missing out on life because of it, and spending an eternity in that. You know, that's effectively torture, which is dark for an MCU film, and it's something that is surface level, as are all of the other themes, because they can't mix them together. You can't fully explore one theme when you have 8 different ones in the film to constantly switch between. They should have, again, made this a TV show so that then each character and each theme gets its own episode, rather than meshing it all together in a messy, inconsistent 2 hours and 45 minutes, to which it felt every second of it, because it is not a well-paced film. The first MCU film that's rotten. I don't think it's the only MCU film that's rotten. If we were to go back and regrade Iron Man 2 and Thor 2, I'm sure they'd be rotten as well. But even then, Eternals is better than those 2 films. As if that's much of a compliment for it. Moving on, we have Ron's Gone Wrong. Now this was a valiant effort from the first film or from its respective animation company. I can't remember it off by name, but the character designs, as you can tell from the poster here, they are incredibly generic, and it does have its usual themes of technology versus real life, I suppose, but this isn't to technology's hindrance. At the end of the day, it looks into either end of the spectrum, and it doesn't tell you right from wrong. It kind of gives you a basis and allows you to draw your own conclusions from there, which is very intricate and clever for a children's film. That's why it's already beaten out most of the DreamWorks films. It's better than Spirit, it's better than Boss Baby 2, and it's from a brand new animation studio. I love the designs too of the little robots. As you can tell, they're all very personal and tailored towards for people who own the bots, I suppose. And yeah, there's just a lot of substance here, maybe a little bit too much substance for the runtime. It does get a little slow paced and a little inconsistent, and the voice acting is very much phoned in and not all too convincing. Things do get very much on the nose, so a little subtlety could have gone a long way of this film, as well as a little bit of better pacing. And it is a first time from a studio, so the animation is fine. That's really the only praise I have for it. I mean, this is 2021, animation should be better than this, but it's still fine. And speaking of what's fine, I'm fine with there being 9 Fast and Furious films. There's going to be more Fast and Furious films, and this, unfortunately, does fall amongst one of the weaker ones for me. I do like the opening. It had so much dread because you know exactly what's going to happen. That was all very well done. And at the end of the day, it's a Fast and Furious film. It's ridiculous. Like, swinging your car across a chasm like it's Tarzan. It's fucking ridiculous. And that's what we pay the movie ticket for. We pay for this entertainment, and boy does this film deliver with its ridiculous nature, and it's so fast paced and goddamn entertaining. Like, you can just turn off your brain, eat some popcorn, and have a thrilling time with this. I do wish there was more of a dynamic between the two brothers, of course, John Cena and Vin Diesel's characters. There could have been just so much more development and chemistry between them, but the change of heart feels very forced at the end of the day, and the villains are changing back and forth, especially in power dynamics, and it becomes, you know, it becomes tiresome after a while, actually, and it's suspense of disbelief. This film does finally carry it a bit too far. I mean, Fast and Furious in space? What were they thinking with that? Oh, it's ridiculous, and I both hate it and love it at the same time. But we get to move on to 49 for Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It. Unfortunately, from all the Conjuring films, this does happen to be the weakest one. Yet still, it works because I love these characters that are crossed over between films. You're invested in their relationship, and this film does a great job throwing them into new dynamics. And there's a really great sense of irony to it, the way the film's structured and all that. Like, the opening in particular, people could have been saved if not for certain events, and that's the ultimate tragedy of it all. Once again, they hold on to your fear and tension rather than unleashing it because they could give you a jump scare here. Nope, false alarm. Instead, they put it there. And so for constant build-up, it's excellently helmed, cinematic wise. It's got some great shots to it, so that's why I'm moving forward to praise the cinematography. And yes, for Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It, whilst not being the strongest Conjuring film, because all of the side characters aren't necessarily as strong, and the film is certainly not as fast paced as those ones neither, and the scares are a little less poignant, they stick with you much less, so naturally the film is a lot more forgettable than the first two. But I still enjoyed it, and it gets a righteous 49th spot on the list. Now, number 48 is going to be Jungle Cruise. Dwayne Johnson was absent from this year's Fast and Furious, so instead we find him here in the jungle. Again. Yeah, Dwayne Johnson just really has something for jungles. Now, Emily Blunt is, as always, a very welcome addition. The acting here is pretty good for chemistry in particular. There was a lot of energy going back and forth, and for entertainment of these two actors do really push you through the film. It's got better pacing than it would do otherwise, and the fact that he was able to build up an entire plot around a fucking Jungle Cruise ride of all things, I find that pretty clever. It definitely had to pull at some very creative strings there, so I do think for exposition is a little out of left field and very poorly executed. They could have had different directors for different styles and executions of said exposition. But ultimately, it's a Disney film, it has that magic to it, it's fun, it's entertaining, and it comes in at number 48. So now we move on to 47 instead for House of Gucci, an excellently performed film with some great costume design and cinematography. The production behind this film, I respect it. I respect the actors. Lady Gaga was fantastic, Adam Driver, Jared Leto, all of them, well, they did well, even though Jared Leto was definitely a bit weird in this film, you could say, but that was the character he was playing, and it could have turned out a whole lot worse. The history behind it too, it just adds more investment to it, knowing the realism behind it. And so for tragic ending, they built up to it well, and you do ultimately feel some sort of emotion from it. That's just basic human compassion speaking, I suppose. But boy, you wind up hating these characters as they grow. It's an excellent example of backwards character growth. So Ridley Scott does a really good job with the execution and direction of this film. It has style. I just find that for material isn't that much I can invest with. For fashion, for murder, it's just nothing that I reminisce with, and so naturally I did find myself dull-founded at times. And say, a lot of the acting is weird, a lot of the choices are weird. There are definitely some things thrown in there that don't feel as though they belong, and sometimes it doesn't mesh together and can become a little bit of a mess, especially on the pacing. It's a very slow-paced film, but at times it tries not to be. You know, people just chalk this up to, oh, it's far too mature and for an acquired taste. That's just the thing. Films should have something behind them that's universally beloved, and this one is just so tailored not to me, unfortunately, and so that's why my opinion of it kind of deteriorates, and it gets 47 on the list. 46 is Cruella, a film with some excellent costume designs and a excellent performance once again from Emma Stone. No surprise there. As a backstory, anti-hero for one of these live-action Disney remakes, this is easily one of the best, and also one of the most mature. It has lots of drinking, it even tackles with death, and just there's a lot of dark shit in this film, which I respect. The fact that they was able to crack this out of a 12A and they made it a lot less Disney than other Disney films. There's risks in this film, and for me, I feel like they ultimately pay off. I like this film, though I still don't think it needed to exist. Once again, I just couldn't see Cruella as the hero. Sure, she's an anti-hero in this, she's a hero who does bad things, but it doesn't feel as though this leads on to 101 Dalmatians. It feels incoherent, and that becomes annoying. The costume design is easily the best respects I have behind this film. The cinematography is basic, it kind of lets the costumes speak for themselves, I suppose. So those are my flaws with the film. Overall, I like it, and it gets 46. Now, 45 is Druga Polowa, translates to Second Half. It's a Polish film based around, relationships and football mostly. So certain characters' football gets in the way of their relationships, and there's misunderstandings here which are just so forced and generic. But yet, for these characters, there's chemistry where you want a relationship, and where you don't want it, there isn't any. So you wind up rooting for the right characters and right dynamics, and in the end, that's what makes it so satisfying, because the film gives you exactly what you want. And I suppose playing it safe is a bit of a frustrating ending, but it put a smile on my face. I like the cinematography, and at the end of the day, it's important to experience foreign cinema from time to time. Sure, I had to read the subtitles, but that didn't make me understand the story any less, because the visuals did a great job of telling itself, and it did have some English songs in there, or at least songs spoken English, so we could understand a lot of the internal emotions of the character. Very on the nose with the songs they chose. I guess that's somewhat a flaw for the film. But overall, it was well paced. It was a good 90 minutes where I remained invested. And ultimately, this is just a great showcase of ensuring that there's character chemistry where it's needed. And the dialogue for that is pretty well written. It has its rhythm and its pacing to it. So there isn't too much to bellyache about even at the end of the day. 44 is still water. This film has a lot of tension, and at the end of the day, for character, again, he isn't necessarily a good guy. He does some really terrible things to get his daughter out of prison, but given the nature and the context, you really care about this. You want the goals to be fulfilled upon, and when they are, it's beyond satisfying. So yeah, this is just a film that knows what it is. It's pretty self-aware. It has some great performances behind it, especially from the lead Matt Damon. It's a shame it didn't do all too well at the box office because, again, it's pretty well paced in my personal opinion, though it can get a little dull and sometimes relationships can feel very forced, and again, there is some very depressive natures behind it which I don't think needed to be fully expanded upon. Like, sometimes there is a lot more positivity into the world to explore in film, but yet still, in writing, you should set about creating investing and in-depthful characters by giving them a simple goal, throwing obstacles in their path, and at the end of the day, this film has constant conflict and resolution, but it all paints, so to say, a bigger picture, and that is some fine writing right there. Cinematography could have been better, so again, that's one of my few flaws dragging this film down for me. It just wasn't as interesting or as unique nor as emotional as other films. You know, it doesn't have that poignancy and that memorability as films like French Exit, which was weird. Like, really weird. The choices made were very unique, I'll give it that. The performances, though, the actors did a perfect job with the material that they were given. I feel like they was just directed on screen to think of a weird moment in their lives and really harness that kind of emotion and awkwardness, because these characters are very jarring. They're extremes. They're the kind that you don't see in the day-to-day, and I suppose the elitist nature of it makes it more entertaining. I just wish that there could have been some ounce of relatability to it, something for me to reminisce with, and at the end of the day, these characters aren't always the most likeable, and there is a slow pace to it, and it's just so weird that I did find myself struggling for joy at moments in this. And speaking of struggling for joy, we have here today a very depressing film. Once again, you look at mental disorder and tragedy, I suppose, and it's executed in a generic way, and yet in this generic fashion it still manages to hit for basic human compassion needs, so you wind up with compassion towards these characters regardless, because it's only human nature. I do wish there was some better execution in terms of the structuring of the story, like when we saw flashbacks, if they were mixed about a bit, we could have either had greater tension or greater dread. Either way, there are inconsistencies too, like relationships are constantly shifting and they never feel as though these characters are in the moment, so to say. You feel as though you're jumping about when you're not. That's just for poor execution. I dropped my cable that I was fiddling with for a moment there. But yeah, here today is just a really odd film to judge, a really hard one, because critically it didn't do too well, but I still think it had enough poignancy to it, memorability and enjoyment. I feel like the pacing was fine, even if a little uneven, so here today gets 42. Now 41 is going to be respect, just barely missing out on the top 40 here. The actor did a great job, and the songs in this film are incredible. I mean, of course they are. And there's lots of really great themes behind it too. When you have a woman of colour as your flagship character, you're obviously going to explore the kind of racial experiences, and it's sad to me that people can go through this on a day-to-day basis, and the amount of work you have to put into for success in comparison to, say, a white man. There is no toss-up, though that's not to say that the success is any more or less earned. That's one of the main themes going through this film, or at least something for me to take away from it. And to say there was something for me to take away from it, unlike these other films prior to where I just couldn't find myself invested because the material being explored just didn't connect with me, and I couldn't ultimately see myself in the film. I can't see myself in this one either, that's another flaw for it. It's very much a different world to mine, but I had more of that enjoyment, and there was more of a universal execution to it, I suppose, which did make it a lot more generic, unfortunately. Like, again, they could have brought in any director and they would have done it in the exact same style and tone. So Respect is a film I respect for, obviously, it's filmmaking, but there could have been stuff in here done much better, such as our number 40th slot, The Many Saints of Newark, a very traditional gangster crime type film with really good character development. It takes place over several years, so you're invested in years and years of these characters' lives, and so the development there is very well helmed. The dialogue in particular is really fun, and there's chemistry in these characters. The elements of tragedy and the themes that they incorporate throughout the film, they feel organic, well placed, and so it just helps the pacing of the film move along in general, and it's perfectly enjoyable. Speaking of perfectly enjoyable, we have The Kingsman at 39. Excellent action, which you've come to expect from this film franchise. The choreography is unparalleled. There are some character deaths that feel so incredibly harsh in this and out of place that did not need to happen. The Golden Circle had the same problem, I suppose, but this is a prequel to those films, and it does incorporate a certain element of actual history into it. Like, there's characters from real life thrown into here, exaggerated of course, and made more so for your entertainment than a reflection in real life, but yet still you've got to commend the fact that there was some passion and some research put into this. There is just a lot of fun to be had here. It really does have great roots as this spy espionage type film, and I enjoyed it, even if it's not the strongest Kingsman movie. It's not got that same amount of energy and liveliness as the very first film, The Secret Service, has, and by very first I mean the first one made. Like, that is still to this day the best one because it has the best villain. Like, the twist reveal in this was so obvious, and the accent got on my nerves a bit, and the villain just doesn't have that same amount of depth to them as what Valentine had, because he had a goal, which at the end of the day you didn't agree with his methods of getting there, but it was definitely something you nodded your head at, and he was like, that is a problem. So a story is only as good as its villain, and The Kingsman doesn't have the most solid of villains. Now we have Land over here at 38. This film is told more so through its visuals than dialogue, and the fact that they can draw back on the dialogue and focus so much more on the cinematography makes it such an excellently crafted film. There is so much just tragedy and emotion, I suppose. Like, it really hits you hard. The ending elevated the entire film for me. It came out of left field, and it's all for the best because the film couldn't have had such a poignant ending without it. You go back upon rewatch, just all of the elements that build up to it, it makes sense in context, and so naturally you learn to grow and really care for these characters, and it's just got a way of life about it that you don't see. You know, once again, this is something different. It tackles different things than what you usually see at film, and because it's so focused on especially like landscape shots, surprisingly a film called Land has a lot of land in it, so I'm not going to say the direction was unique or stylized particularly. The cinematography most certainly was, and so definitely not a best director's choice from me, but there was still just so much to admire about this film's production, even if it was a very slow burn. Like, the pacing here definitely is not its strong suit neither. And now we're going to move on to 37, Bellbottom, an Indian film I believe, and a very bizarre one at that. It had a lot of style to it, and the acting was very unique. It gave this film a certain flair that I invested in from beginning to end, because it had its comedic moments, but it also had its serious moments. It was a really fine balance in the middle there. It's just a lot of fun. What else can I say about it, really? Sure, it's certainly not the best film, and it did get a little uneven, especially since the comedic tones combined with the serious tones did feel uneven at times. Those are tones that really do not mesh together And so I do respect for direction and style. For cinematography, once again, it's nothing to write home about. But I enjoyed it, and that's the key thing. You want to go into a film to enjoy it. That should be, at the end of the day, a film's primary purpose. And speaking of enjoying films, we have People Just Do Nothing Big in Japan. Now this one also had themes that had a really great group dynamic, and the fact that they're being torn apart by a lot of arrogance mostly. It's a very fitting theme to tackle, especially given these characters in context. It's like the perfect step to take them. So executing upon this foundation here that People Just Do Nothing has laid. I've not seen the original show, unfortunately, but this is a great standalone film. At the end of the day, you can watch this without that context and you still get to absorb like this group dynamic for fun, for chemistry. And when there isn't chemistry there anymore, you start to miss it. It starts to feel a lot more empty. So that's why you're rooting for these characters to continue on their traditional paths, which you've kind of grown in love with them for in the first place. So this was definitely an absolutely entertaining film, if nothing else. So People Just Do Nothing Big in Japan gets 36. Now 35 is going to be Venom Let There Be Carnage. Once again, not the best made film, far from it in fact, but boy is it entertaining. It has just ridiculous scenes in it. It's a shame that for main action sequences saved at the very end and it's very short and all that. Carnage just didn't have enough presence, and Woody Harrelson didn't convince me as part of a role, I suppose. It's just too short, but at the end of the day, the length is also perfect. You could get more screenings of it in a single day. It doesn't outstay its welcome. So I just wish for a film Let There Be Carnage, there was more carnage. There is disappointing elements, but just for chemistry between Venom and Eddie Brock, that was the best part of the first film, and they doubled down on it here. They knew what worked. The fact that Venom is subtly talking about gay culture in the midst of it all, there is some hilarity whilst not being insensitive behind it, and it's very cleverly helmed. So I enjoyed this film. Again, that should be a film's primary purpose, to entertain, and boy does this film do exactly just that. Now 34 is going to be Godzilla vs. Kong, easily one of the most entertaining films of the year, and one of the biggest surprises too. I'm normally not a big fan of these monster type films because I like good characters and intricately woven stories with complex themes and emotions behind them, and this had more than what the other Godzilla and Kong movies had. Bringing all these characters together, like, sure, it did feel like a bit of a mess at points, and for constant switch between storylines you had for Godzilla one running, for Kong one running, and they didn't necessarily connect. They felt jarring. They even dragged the pace in at points. The action was fantastic. You know, you got what you wanted out of this film. That's the key thing. You got Godzilla versus Kong, but the fan service was just so heavy in this film that it became, as I've used several times in this video, jarring. So now we're going to move on to 33, Nobody. Now this guy, I can assure you, is not a nobody. In fact, he's a somebody, and a hard somebody at that. This is a John Wick style action flick. My apologies that I couldn't get a good resolution for the poster. I suppose people were beating it up like our main character's face right here. And you should truly never underestimate Nobody, because this character, first of all, despite the fact that he's going around beating people up, you still have respect for him because he's doing it reasonably, in the fact that there's context, there's reasons behind it. Like, there's one group harassing this young girl on the bus, so he saves her. He goes after this couple that robbed them. Initially, he just kind of let them rob them, despite the fact that we know from the end of the film he easily could have took them, but he let them do that because they were clearly desperate, and he misunderstands. He thinks they took something important to his young daughter, so he goes back just for that, nothing else. And then when he sees that they have the baby, obviously he gets the watch back, but he leaves them with everything else so they can take care of their sick and dying baby. So at the end of the day, like, there's a lot of depth behind this main character, and because of that, you really care for him more, and that brings a lot more dread to the action sequences. You don't want to see this character hurt. I mean, he has a family, for Pete's sake. He's a family man. He's more of a retired hero than anything, but, you know, the action is captivating, it's well choreographed. The fact that we have such a hard ass in the lead, those kind of roles are always compelling to me. I kind of grew up with this old school type action hero, so Nobody is a film that very much spoke to me personally, and I enjoyed it because it was a film literally made for me. Of course I'm going to enjoy it. Now 32 is Ghostbusters Afterlife. Wow, I really put this high. I probably should have put it down a few pegs because I suppose since it came out recently it's more so my head than all the others. And ultimately this is something done much better than for 2016 Ghostbusters. It balances fan service whilst being its own unique entity because it's that sequel of the first two Ghostbusters films. So there definitely is something in here to put a smile on your face, and the pacing is good enough. I feel as though a lot of this is kind of like the trapping of ghosts and all that, so there's not a lot of hand-to-hand type combat and action in films. That's how I define it. I define it as punching and kicking, and you don't have punching and kicking in this film, so it's not the kind of action I invest myself with, and it did become a little bit dull and boring. Not for martial arts segments though, that part was truly brilliant, and I suppose that's why I put it at 32, because again this is a film I watched with my mum and she loved that segment so much. Just watching her reaction put a huge smile on my face. And I say this is a film that entertains. It has characters in it that are convincing as kids. They all have chemistry even with one another. They're just fun acts to observe. So overall there was stuff I didn't like in this film so much, but there was also stuff mixed in there that felt welcome and was a great addition to the franchise moving forward. So Ghostbusters Afterlife gets 32. So moving on to 31, we have Croods Too Easily for Best DreamWorks Animated Film. Again, this came out 2020 in the US, but it's counted on this list because we here in the UK didn't get it until like June of 2021. Yeah, like 8 months later. Was it worth the wait? I mean, it's another Croods film. It's better than the first. I do think it leans in more to what worked about the first one, especially for family dynamic. There's some really great growth there, and the characters just have so much chemistry. There's a lot of energy here as well. It's so much fun, so watching forward before you. For Newmans though, those characters are just so unlikable, except for, of course, the teenage daughter. But this film has a really good sense of adventure. It goes from point A to point B with spectacular fashion. And there's definitely some relatability and realism behind these characters, because I'm sure if we were in their positions as teenagers or as parents, there are subtle things for us to relate to, and they actually have a mother-daughter scene in this, which was again a welcomed addition, adding to that family dynamic there. And so Croods 2 isn't a film that's gonna blow your brains out with raw awesomeness, but it is gonna give you an energetic 90 minutes of raw fun, I suppose, with characters that give you a little, or it's not giving you a lot. And now, picking off the top 30 is Black Widow, a film which, oddly enough, I found disappointing. It's high up on the list. I liked it. How can it be disappointing? I wanted it to be better. I mean, we do get one of the best MCU characters moving forward, Yelena. Yeah, I love Florence Pugh and the role. We should have just made the whole film without her. Just saying. But all of that aside, unfortunately, this film is so busy on its heavy action sequences that it forgets to develop upon these characters and give you just a solid foundation for their family dynamic moving forward. Like, sure, it has its themes of finding family and where does it really come from? Is it who gave birth to you, or is it the family you find along the way? Like Black Widow is constantly bringing up the Avengers as her family, which in her respect it kind of is, but at the same time there is this like host family that is all what Florence Pugh's character ever knew. That was the best part of her life. So seeing that juxtaposition between what these characters know and really care about, it increased the tension and dynamic of these characters tenfold and really added to the pacing, I suppose. Like some of these best scenes, despite all the forced humour, that dinner scene is incredible with its character utilization, I suppose. And of course when David Harbour's character goes to sing to Yelena, my apologies, I keep butchering all of this, just talking. Talking is hard, okay? But still, I do wish for action kind of took a backseat, because they're introducing new characters, new concepts, and yet we can't really be left to invest in any of them, because soon as we're hooked on a storyline, we move on to another action scene. As soon as we're hooked on another action scene, it ends, because they have to be short in order to allow for a runtime. Either way, the balance here isn't great. 29 is Dream Horse. Now we're really moving on to the 8 out of 10s. This film was so incredibly heartwarming. I was thoroughly invested in this horse's journey from beginning to end, and Toni Collette just creates such a charming lead character, and all of these, like, it's based on a true story, and it feels that way because you have downsides to these characters, upsides, character development, just stuff that you see on a day-to-day basis. It's set here in the UK, so I always have the soft spot for films that are set for me locally, because again, it gives me something more to reminisce with, and it felt that way because these actors, I believe, they're British actors, so if they aren't, they did a great job being British. And Dream Horse is just a film where the name isn't the greatest. I mean, it's just dream and horse, it's two words put together. But that doesn't take away from the enjoyment and the fact that I remember this film because it put a smile on my face. It truly is a heartwarming tale that leads to something that felt earned and wanted. Now, 58, where I'm going to get 58 from, we're actually at 28, Final Account. This is a film that you kind of have to love. If you don't love this documentary, then well, let's just say its source material is the final account even of the last living generation of Hitler's third, reach. So basically, they're looking at Nazis and Holocaust and all of that dark type material, which is why I say you've kind of got to love it, because it tackles just such important material which should not be disrespected. This is something to be taken seriously, and going through this film you get that emotion, and from body language alone you see regrets, you see kind of turmoil they went through in their youth, and the fact that they're able to recall these tales from such an old age. I have mad respects for the subjects of these interviews, and the fact that this film came out and this film needed to be made, and it needed to be made now, because otherwise these final accounts never would have been taken. They just would have been lost to time, when unfortunately, as everyone does, these people would pass on. So there is no understating the importance of this film, this documentary film, I should say. And sure, I found myself a little dulled by it, because I'm not the most invested when it comes to documentaries, and there was a few jarring moments, like they will randomly cut no interview whatsoever. They'll just have silent environmental type shots, but they come in at a welcomed position structurally to allow you to truly breathe and sink in all of the information that has just been presented before you. So there's upsides and there's downsides to it all, and at the end of the day, it's a film that you kind of gotta love, and I do love it along the way. Now, number 27 is No Time to Die, one of the best Bond films. So I've heard. I haven't actually watched any of the other ones. That's right, I'm the idiot who started with No Time to Die. Now, I love the music in this. The music was very cool. You get stuff that you want to see as a Bond enthusiast. If I was a Bond enthusiast, I would be going crazy over for cars and for hot women and the drinks. It gives you that signature flair that the character is known for at the end of the day, and it created a conclusion that was very memorable and satisfying for the way the film panned out. It had some excellent action sequences and great cinematography to truly give you a cinematic wide scope of things. It made a lot of money, and deservingly too, because the action sequences, this was a film with a budget behind it and a passion and a cast that really cared for it, and it all shows through. Sure, it wasn't April 2020 in the end, but we got the film eventually, and it was a blast. Now, moving on, we have Candyman at 26, a film I thoroughly enjoyed. This here remake of the original. First of all, you have in the profession an artist. So the artist for the main character who turns into this monster, this creature. It's a really cool concept. I admire it. For Monster himself, for Candyman, he's terrifying. There is some really great elevated horror here because the film tackles really great themes, especially behind, racial injustice, I suppose. And it gets dark, it gets gruesome, and it's all the more investing for it because of the risks it takes and the risks that pay off because of it. Bit of a short summary of why I love this film, I suppose, but we're going to move on to Antlers at 25 without further ado. A very odd film, but then again, that is Guillermo del Toro's style. In his traditional style, the humans have kind of became the real monsters in this. And instead, the actual monsters are more sympathetic. He has his powerful use of colour to draw such emotion and add further beauty with cinematography. You have blues and reds really do invoke the sense of danger and warning, I suppose. So the fact that he's able to elevate his horror through the use of colour just makes the cinematography all the more jaw-dropping, dare I say. I was looking up at this film in awe with how good it looked on the big screen. Now, number 24 is Freaky, yet again another film I watched with my mum, and she tends to get in quite a laughing fit, shall we say, when people are killed off in ridiculous ways, like stuff that basically, if it's too realistic and it's just gory for the sake of being gory, then it's not nearly as gratuitous. But in this case, he shoves a smashed up wine bottle down a guy's throat and hits his neck so hard that the bottle smashes and blood is squirted everywhere. Deaths like that are absolutely ridiculous because they just wouldn't happen in real life. Nobody, not even this serial killer with immense strength, would go around having such sadistic ways to kill. The creativity behind that, a man sawn in half too. There's just so much more fun to horror films like these when they don't take themselves too seriously and there's some self-awareness behind them, and they just have such ridiculous deaths shot well, edited well together to make the viewing experience all the more fun. And at the end of the day, for a body swap film, sure, it has its generic roots and the tropes that it goes through, and I love the fact that there's the acting. You have Vince Vaughn playing a teenage girl at the end of the day. Like, the performances here are great, and the acting and the casting is all part of the fun behind it. But it's definitely not the strongest film, but I had so much fun watching it that it deserves 24 in my personal opinion. And if I started the conversation there and failed to end it, as I have done with films already in this video, my apologies. Unfortunately, when you go off on a bit of a ramble without a script, this is what happens. Now we're going to move on without further ado to The French Dispatch at number 23. This was structured as a bunch of little mini stories, each one having its own unique style, and at the end of the day, it's not too jarring when they shift up a style, because you see it coming. There's warnings, there's kind of like a natural transition within the film, and the cinematography just oozes Wes Anderson's signature style. You have your symmetry, your use of the colour yellow, like his favourite colour, and you have just lots of shots with overlaid voiceovers to execute upon this story in a unique fashion, I suppose. But point is, you go through a lot of visual storytelling all at once, and it keeps the pacing moving forward. It is a shame that it's several short stories, because some of these stories are so good that they would have worked as their own whole feature film. So naturally the film can feel a little surface level at points, and that has its disappointing elements to it. And there is one point in the film where it just gets a little bit too freakish and out there, and it completely drops my immersion entirely because it turns 2D and animated for some reason. So yes, sometimes the ridiculous nature of the film does hinder it. But we're going to move on to 22, which is Raya and the Last Dragon. Wow, why did I pronounce it that way? But this film, it definitely deserved to be shown in theatres, because boy, the animation is gorgeous, and they had so many food scenes, because that was where the passion lied with the film creators. At the end of the day, it makes perfect sense doing what he did with this film. It's a film that has a universal message, and a very important one for the time it came out. It came out in a time during a pandemic, when what we really needed was a story with great roots into Asian culture. By the way, they did a great job, like expressed upon that and showing the world the power, the visuals of this culture. So now everyone, not just Asians, can enjoy this Asian culture. But going back to what I was saying about how it's a personal film, this one, and this universal message of trust was just something that we all needed to absorb. And the fact that we could all take away something from this film goes to show like the broad appeal of Disney films in general, I suppose. The action choreography was phenomenal in this. I wish there was more action, and it's a shame that the film is so location hopping. You aren't given enough time to invest in a single location because you're going through like 4 or 5 all at the same time, and the first 40 minutes is all set up. The pacing here is horrendous, but ultimately that's my only flaw with this film. Otherwise, I love the action. I do think the payoffs could have been handled a whole lot better, like certain character choices make no sense, and the villain, well, the anti-hero, I suppose, in Chitari is her name, I believe, yeah, her whole lack of development became a nuisance, a hindrance, just kind of behaviour that isn't justified and came out of nowhere ultimately. There's no development, no leading to it, and I just feel as though there should have been more of consequence to her actions, and especially for trauma she caused. She made Raya unable to trust anyone because of her ultimate betrayal. So yeah, there's definitely some characters that needed further ironing out before this went through development, but it's still a very well animated film. The baby characters just got annoying and incredibly cringy. It felt so out of place in a film that somewhat takes itself quite seriously, especially when it has emotional beats talking about lost loved ones to what is effectively a plague. So how you can bounce from scenes like that to a baby performing a heist, I don't know. And yeah, it's a very mixed film almost, but mixed positive, that's for sure. Now 21 is going to be, well, it's called Druk in its home language, but it translates to another round. And this is about characters literally drinking themselves to death, but at the end of the day, like, that's what makes the performances so great, because acting drunk isn't about, acting drunk. It's about acting as someone who's drunk, trying not to be drunk. At the end of the day, when I've had a drink, I stutter, I slur my words, but I try my hardest not to, so it starts to, I'm not, oh shit, a bit like that. Through voice acting alone, as I'm doing right now, it's tough, but case in point, the actors did it to that extent, and they did it a lot better than me, so I love performances. Sure, it was all subtitled, but at the end of the day, there was a lot of emotion behind this film, but it was also very personal, very passionate. This came from experience, you can tell, based on the direction here. It's stylized and unique, and there's consequences to the actions here because characters unfortunately pass on and they send him off with, as the title would imply, another round. It's just so elegantly crafted, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But now we get to move on to the top 20, kicked off by Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Kicked off quite literally because this is very much inspired by traditional martial art type films that I grew up with. I grew up with all your Jean-Claude Van Damme's, Schwarzenegger's, Stallone's, Jackie Chan's and all that. I love this style of action. And boy, the film did it justice. This isn't the best Marvel film. The best one is yet to come, at least of this year anyway. I do like the dynamic between the father and the son. It's a very personal conflict, and that's what makes it so driven. There's also a dragon in this movie, and as we all know, dragons for me are an instant win. Awkwafina just can't seem to get away from dragons in her roles, apparently, but it's not just any dragon, it's the traditional, Asian dragon, so the design work is, once again, elegantly crafted to shed a light upon this culture that Shang-Chi is set upon. So I love the action choreography here, it's fantastic. The personal conflict of it all, the superhero suit, you can never fault a good superhero suit. And yes, that is what makes Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings even a really good Marvel film, and I can't wait to see more from these characters. Now, number 19 is Encanto. Here is where we get to the 10 out of 10s. This was a spectacular year for films. Seriously, 19 through 1. I wish they could all be number 1 because I love all these films so much, and Encanto is no different. It's easily my favourite animated film of the year. Which is odd, because normally animated films get up in the top 10 for me when they're my favourite of the year, but I suppose that just goes to show the powerhouse that these next few films are going to be. Now, Encanto has some really memorable songs. We don't talk about Bruno being the top of them all, given how successful that song has been for Disney. And it was a perfect Christmas treat too. They dropped it on Disney Plus way earlier than I was expecting. And for film, it's beautifully animated. You can see from the colours on this poster alone, and the fact that all characters have their style visually to differentiate them from one another. So you have one side of the family that have orange attire, the other have like pink and blue, so it really tells its character through visuals and colour, because even Casita is a character in and of itself, and a badass at that. Like, it saves everyone's lives towards the end, and these are the people with effectively superpowers. They have gifts and they're incapable of saving themselves from a fallen building. It's very good how it's done with its themes that aren't quite as universal as Raya's, which is why at first glance I enjoyed Raya more, but upon rewatch I can't stop rewatching Encanto, because it's such even an energetic film with great pacing. And the themes ultimately pay off, because Abuela's character, you know, unlike Chitauri in Raya the Last Dragon, she feels consequences of her actions, and for trauma she causes other characters isn't just dismissed. Instead, they kind of like rise above it and grow as a family. The dynamic here, like, being part of a large family, I'm sure you could relate in that situation with pressure and all that. I have a friend who would go through family pressure all the time, being the youngest in a line of very successful siblings. You know, she always had to get good grades and had to do this and had to do that for the best of her abilities, and if she slipped, if she faltered, you know, she couldn't let her family down. I don't have that same problem, so I couldn't reminisce with this film as deeply as others, and yet I still had this level of enjoyment of it. So that goes to show how much of a strong film Encanto truly is, and I loved it. So it's a worthy 19. Now number 18 is going to be Free Guy. The only time I've heard people dislike this film is my roommates. I guess they just have terrible taste in films, but with Free Guy, it has just such a sense of energy. The visuals aren't finished, it feels like, and sometimes they are a little jarring for a, you know, pretty much AAA blockbuster. First of all, to have one based on an original IP is a merit in of itself, but second of all, I do think the visuals could have been a lot more finalized. But I still love the fact that this is a film that invests you in a game. You feel like you're playing a game but watching a film all at the same time. It is beyond investing. The sound is so perfectly crisp and managed, so everything in this film makes you root and care for its main character. Ryan Reynolds does a great job playing himself, and ultimately it could have had just terrible gags about a culture that the writers they themselves knew nothing about, and it's not that. It was clever, well written, and a very enjoyable film. But number 17 is going to be Dune, an absolute slayer at the Oscars, in terms of nominations anyway. For winners are yet to be announced. I'm willing to bet Encanto's probably going to get the animated one, but that's the only one I can predict as of this time. This video is definitely going to come out after the Oscars though, and hopefully this has won a few things. It's a shame it didn't get put up for Best Director. This is the same director as who made Blade Runner 2049, and he definitely has his cinematic style. He has just real awe when it comes to his shot choices. For cinematography in this film, you have just the sand gushing over with the wind, these elements combined together to give you visual storytelling unlike any other, because the dialogue here is surprisingly small for a film that has so much story to set up. Like, this is a deep and complex world based on one of sci-fi's oldest novels, so they did a great job adapting the book for starters. I've read parts of it, so the parts I've read I see translated very well in the film. The performances are great with the cast that feel fitting, and the chemistry is certainly there. I do wish we saw more of Zendaya though, given she was a big part of the marketing. It is tragic what happens to these characters. You know, it really does speak to human emotion, and so that makes it more memorable because it upsets you what happens to these characters, I suppose. But the action, the cinematography, the film is just a visual marvel from beginning to end. The sound is crisp, same as Free Guy, so the investment, the background lore, and just everything pumped in this film was filled with passion and ambition, most of all. This is easily one of the most ambitious films of 2021, and it shows. Number 16 is The Courier, a much more small-scale, lower-budget film than Dune, but it does very well with its resources because it's about, spies within the Soviet Union, and Benedict Cumberbatch is effectively feeding information back to the British. And so there is inherent conflict and dread here. You're worried because you care about these characters. At the end of the day, these characters are servicing their country, and you don't want to see them punished for just doing those good deeds for the benefit of those around them. And sure, these characters are flawed, but in the end they still make the right choices and they're left with no regrets, which is probably the most powerful thing of it all. Benedict Cumberbatch, his performance in this is spectacular. I loved his performance. He was captivating from beginning to end, and The Courier is just one of the most powerful films of the year because of it. Now, kicking off our top 15 is a film called After Love, a very small scale drama type film. That's a mix of trauma and drama because this is literally recounting the story of after love. Someone's husband has died, and now, she's seeing other relatives and she has to reveal what has happened to this man. And so it's almost kind of like an imposter type film because she's coming into these people's lives and she's winning over their trust and their hearts, only to ultimately betray them in the end. So you respect what she's trying to do and you see it in a conflict within her. There's an awkwardness behind it, but at the same time you feel so sorry for the people who she's betraying. And so there's just so much poignancy in it. It's a drama film through and through with tropes that pay off because you want to see these things. You go into a film with a certain amount of expectations, and this film, it delivers. What a powerful film indeed. But moving on to number 14, we have Censor. Now, unlike Malignant, this is a really odd horror film done right, and it's not only its unique execution and style that works so well. Like the Kingsman, it has history behind it, and that realism almost kind of lends to its tone very well, because this talks about the censorship in, for British film industry, I suppose, for video nasties, which were notorious because you could so easily walk into a store and pick up a video nasty. Their accessibility is what was so terrifying because a child could watch it and get traumatized, or just anyone who's messed up psychologically could induce copycat type behaviour based on what they saw in these films. So they were a menace to society and they had to be stopped, and they had to be, as the title would suggest, censored. So it's not only that, but that is incorporated into its story so well, because here you have a main character who's looking out for her sister, and so for more films she watches, she suddenly gets invested in this actress out of nowhere thinking it's her sister, and so she's kind of brought to madness, and she becomes a victim of her own self anxieties, her own mental disorders, and so it becomes all the more horrific because it's such a psychological horror, and those are always most terrifying for ones that take place in your head. Now, number 13 is going to be Spencer, one of the finest performances I've ever seen. And luckily, Kristen Stewart did get the Oscar nomination. We'll have to wait and see if she wins. But it's a film that normally I don't get all too much more invested in because I'm not huge on period dramas. I find that ancient times are a bit boring and, ancient. I call this one ancient. It is still, for 20th century, so it's not as much of a bore fest as I usually find films like this, especially since I was so captivated by Kristen Stewart's performance. This was a character I learnt to care for. She's a family type woman despite being thrown into royalty where she's expected to behave and look a certain way, and that pressure truly gets to her psychologically. And so there is so much depth to this character that I found investing from beginning to end, and the growth she goes through It's spectacular. Anyway, we got Supernova with Stanley Tucci and Colin Firth. One of the finest, most emotional films I've ever experienced. This isn't a film you watch, you truly experience this film. It's not soft in any way, it tackles very heavy emotional disorders, but it juxtaposes that with cinematography. As you can tell, it has lots of soft colours, lots of greens, blues, browns. Its location is excellently thought through, like everything else is in this film. It's very well written, so the dialogue, our two main characters have such great chemistry, and not to mention they are 2K men. So seeing all of that on screen, it's once again a film that had to be made because it has just such excellent performances, and it tackles just such an important area that needs educating upon. We need personal films like this that tackle such emotions that other films couldn't even hope of raising, so that then we have not only uniqueness in our cinema but also an understanding, and that's why you experience this film, because there's something to ultimately take away from it in the end. Now, number 11 is The Night House. This is some of the most atmospheric horror I've ever seen, because it's horror not with a monster, but instead it has like jump scares and manipulation of environment around it to generate like true fear and tension. The story isn't most memorable, unfortunately, but that's about where my films begin, and flaws even with this film begin and end. The colour palette is great. Look at the juxtaposition here between the blue and the red. It's gorgeous whilst also telling a story in it of itself, and that's where this film exceeds. It's one of my favourite horror films of the year, if not my favourite like traditional type horror film, because it's just so well crafted. The performances are excellent. Like, horror performances are always so often overlooked, as was this one. Like, for main actress here, I believe her name is Rebecca Hall, that's what the poster would imply, but the point is, she deserved that Oscar nomination, and like Toni Collette, she got snubs. Now, kicking off our top 10 is The Father. Unfortunately, this is a film that I myself couldn't reminisce with. I don't have grandparents that suffer nasty dementia, but it's so easy to see why this was so critically acclaimed, because again, it tackles those important like mental disorders that often goes unexplored in film. You have to take risks from time to time, and you have to do justice for these unfortunate, disabled people. And for acting, for performances here, do such a great job throwing you into this mindset. You become disorientated, and that's what makes you all the more sorry for the main character. Like, that's what raises your compassion and sympathy and investment within him in of itself in his mind, because you suffer that same confusion as the scenes play out in the most perfect structure possible. I couldn't have been more invested and more impressed with the elegant craft behind this movie. And I could say the same for number 9, Nomadland, the Oscar winner, which didn't hit UK theatres until January 1st, so it barely struck onto this list. Now, Nomadland is a film that once again you experience. It has lots of depressive nature behind it, lots of mental instability and pain, and you feel that pain. Infrastructure is great. The cinematography too is fantastic. Just look at this poster, for Pete's sake. Chloe Zhao, it's a shame she had to go on to direct Eternals, because this film is so much more better. She clearly handles like smaller scale stories much better, which have a focus on the drama, because at the end of the day she brought these deeper and more human themes, like truly human themes. She brought those to Eternals, despite the fact that these are eternal beings. But the problem is that that film was too large scale and trying to do too much at once. This film is perfectly scaled to have that balance and do all of the right things. It's slow paced, it's a very slow burn, as all films of this type are, but that is something that was thought out. That is intentional at the end of the day. It's meant to be a slow burn. That's how life crumbles. Unfortunately, life isn't perfect, and for most of us it's hard, it's challenging. And this film sheds a light on all of that, and it's a must-watch, especially even if you have Disney Plus, given that it's on that. is on that streaming site, shall I say. But moving on to number 8, we have The Suicide Squad. Very underrated, and it's a shame that it flopped at the box office, actually, because I had so much fun with this film. It is a lot better than the original Suicide Squad. I really need to slow down my speaking here, but if I don't, this video is going to be like 3 hours long. So, with this film, it has a lot more emotion behind it because you care about the characters a lot more than the original Suicide Squad. They have more chemistry, and the film, tonally, it has its style behind it because James Gunn knows his comedy. At the end of the day, like, sure, not everyone's going to like his grotesque form of more mature humour. I loved it, however. I think the film is hilarious. I love these characters. For opening took me by surprise. I would have liked to have seen more of those characters before they just all got brutally mowed down. Man, that was... As tragic as the opening was, it was memorable. And the pacing of this film couldn't have been more perfect. It's so fast-paced. It goes by in no time whatsoever. And the man-eating shark, I forget his name, but he was such an MVP in this film. He was hilarious and so lovable too. Like, these are villains, and yet they are lovable because they have just such a charisma to them. And naturally we move on to In the Heights at number 7. Yet another flop, which I'm really disappointed about because for music, right here it was really upbeat and energetic despite the depressing nature of the story moving forward, because these are people losing their homes and their community, and yet there is still such positivity and energy found in the songs and the interactions, and you care about these characters, their dynamics. There's some really huge emotional payoffs here, you know, what characters say winds up becoming important in building up the plot and developing upon these characters. It's just overall a musical where you enjoy the songs, but you don't just come for the songs, you come for the characters, you come for the cinematography. Like, at the end of the day, this is a very stylized film to feel fitting within its setting with the character expressions and all that. You couldn't find a more culminated and concise and coherent project in the fact that everyone working to it were all working towards the same thing, and they were also passion driven at the same time. Now, number 6 is my favourite musical of the year, West Side Story. Barely beaten out In the Heights for me because this is a film where it definitely has its basis even on the classical story. You know, it has Romeo and Juliet, and then from there it has the West Side Story theatre play, and then the West Side Story film they made several years back when the Twin Towers was still a thing. So, look, there's history there, but ultimately this might be more of a historical piece, but yet its themes, you'd think they would be outdated, but they aren't. That's the sad thing about it. Themes from this film that should be outdated by 20 years are still relevant to this day, and that's probably the most powerful thing about it, the fact that it gives you such insight. And that's what I love about film, the spotlight it can give to lesser known cultures and areas of the world that deserve that spotlight. The songs are memorable, the performances are excellent, and for community in this, like sure, you have the gang wars breaking out between the Jets and the Sharks, but for community within their own separate groups, and for romantic chemistry between, of course, two members of each, a forbidden love, you could say, is all powerful, especially cinematically, because they really managed to highlight using their cinematography. Like, it's spectacular, their utilization of framing to tell story. And yes, it's a tragic one, but because of the tragedy, it's all the more powerful for it. Number 5 is Spider-Man No Way Home. A lot of you are going to think I'm crazy for putting the film at number 5, but when you see the top 4, you'll see why this is here. Spider-Man No Way Home, I think I'm just kind of continuing a broken record here, because I have the same stuff to say about it what's already been said. It works on so many levels, not only on a fan service level, but also as a conclusion to this trilogy, because Tom Holland has truly made his character his own, and he brings such humanity into his role. In fact, that's what the director does with all of these Spider-Man MCU films. He adds a human touch. Even Doctor Strange, he struggles to see past Peter's powers, but he forgets he's just a kid, and at the end of the day, he sympathizes with Peter. He is kind of, he's mentoring him in a way, and so there's a really great dynamic there. Like, they told a story with Doctor Strange in the midst of Spider-Man that worked. It worked as a conclusion, and Tom Holland helped improve the ending of this film tenfold by having his input, and thank God for studio listening to him. Having all these villains too, it increases the stakes and the tension, because these characters could flip at any point, especially for Green Goblin. That dread it raises, the film has its risks that really pay off. I mean, killing off Aunt May, what a ball-busting move. I really respect what they did with this film. Adding in Spider-Man from generations past, it was a great celebration of 20 years of cinematic Spider-Man, I suppose, for style and the execution. So I do think the film has a little bit of a slow beginning, and that does make the pacing uneven, but that's about where my flaws begin and end. I love the visuals. When we go into the mirror dimension, it's all so cinematic. I can't emphasize this enough. The action is fantastic too. This is a film that I love. I just can't get over the fact that the pacing is so uneven, I suppose, and I do have a little bit of bias against this film because I do feel like it's a tad overrated. Sure, it's good. It's just not that good. But I'll tell you what is that good. The Last Duel. Barely missing out on a medal like it did at the box office and the award season. What were they thinking with the lack of nominations this film got? Ridley Scott, easily Best Director. This film, so well handled with its cinematography, its themes, its writing. The dialogue sticks with you, and at the end of the day, there's a tragedy behind it. There's a lot of tension, and you wind up invested in the same story 3 times over. That's what's so surprising about it. The film is long, and you'd think it would be a huge hindrance on the pace, going through 3 different perspectives, one after the other. Well, it's broken up so it can act like chapters. So one day, you watch the first chapter, one perspective. The next day, you watch the next chapter. It's kind of like a TV show type style. But you wind up so invested that you want to learn the full story and how the pieces all come together in the end. It feels like poetry. This film is amazing, and it all ends in some of the greatest action I've ever seen on screen. The Last Duel, what the film is named after, what it all leads up to. It is such a satisfying ending. You have ups and downs, an absolute roller coaster of emotions as you go through just such a bloody battle. You're actually struggling for who you want to root for, because all characters have been given their reasons moving forward to uphold their family honour, or believing that they thoroughly were in the right despite the fact that this is rape. Driver, rape. Yeah, his character kind of rapes Jodie Comer, who is a standout in this film, a relatively unknown actress who's going up against Matt Damon and Adam Driver, and she holds her own. That's how good the performances are in this film. And the fact that they were really able to get you into minds of these characters, for depth they have, psychologically incredible stuff. For character building is incredible. The world, the setting. Boy, I love this film, and I really, really wish it did better. It deserved to do better. But kicking off our top 3 with the bronze medal, Last Night in Soho, a very underrated film. This should be like 100% Rotten Tomatoes, I kid you not, because sure, it can become a little jarring for shift between its, kind of like lively, energetic drama to its slashing elements. But at the end of the day, I liked that. I felt like it was a deserving twist, and one that we kind of saw coming. Like, at the end of the day, between the jump scares and the early setups, like, it was a slow build up to this inevitably, and as you can see, there's always a split between blue light, red light, and that red light is a constant warning of what's to come, and that this film will have that balance with it. Edgar Wright's done a great job with colour in this, and he's done a great job exploring a new style altogether, because this isn't a comedy. This is something with lots of death, lots of drama, but yet for beginning, it's focusing on fashion, for setting of London, and the fact that that's characterised. It gives atmospheric horror, psychological horror. In other words, elevated horror that makes you terrified in different ways than just a monster that wants to rip you apart. Arrgh. I'm going to apologise for that now, but case in point, I love the editing in this film too. It's so spiced up and fast paced. I'm not sure that's even a term, but here I am saying it anyway. Boy, do I love this film. But number 2 is actually going to go to King Richard. Now, I am definitely hoping that Will Smith gets best performance here, because if he doesn't get it here, I don't think he's ever going to give us a better performance than this. He was so good in this film. And yet, as were all the other actors, like, you could have a juxtaposition between Will Smith, who is giving it his all, and then all the other actors who really pale in comparison. That's not what happens at all. All of the actors here are fantastic, and again, it looks into the problem with, you know, being young, being black, and getting into such a competitive scene, I suppose. And, you know, Will Smith's character, his father, and it's controversial, but that's what makes it so compelling. The idea that you definitely don't agree with his methods, but you see where it's getting him, and in the end it all pays off. You know, he is one clever lad that Will Smith plays in this. King Richard, the literal title of the film. The tennis sequences are really captivating, and you ultimately feel sorry for the ending, because, Venus definitely deserved that win there, but that's just the world of tennis for you. Again, it's shedding a light on something relatively unknown, and it really gives you education, and the realism behind it too. This comes from a true story, so you invest further knowing that these events are based in truth. What a fantastic film. Not quite as good as my personal favourite film of the year, A Quiet Place Part 2. Not the best film ever made, not even close, but it is my favourite, and I have so much to say about it, so prepare for a 2.5 hour rant about what makes this film so good and why it's my favourite film of 2021. You can disagree with me all you like, this is my personal opinion. So, with this film, the first one had a really strong family dynamic, and you really invested in it. I was worried going into this film that it wouldn't have the same, but I was wrong. The father's death and his sacrifice inspires the daughter, Raya. That's her name, I hope it is. This is my favourite film, you'd hope I know something about it. Ironically, I haven't seen it since I first saw it in theatres, and this was the first, like, big, bustling film to come out of theatres when they reopened here in the UK. This was the first one to make some money, the first one to get people back into theatres again, and it helped it was exclusive to theatres too. But say, with A Quiet Place Part 2, going back to Raya's character, she goes through such a strong arc in this film, and they make the family dynamic live on, and they make these characters always feel connected through the use of editing, because it's edited in a way to keep the pace moving forward. There's never a dull moment. This is a thriller, well, a horror thriller through and through. The acting just really makes you feel the pain of these characters. Like, when Marcus steps in a bear trap, you feel such pain, you cringe at it. Like, I swear down, this kid actually got put in a bear trap for this performance, because it is convincing as all hell. You wind up you dread for runtime of the film, because characters have died in this series before. Killing off the father from the first film was the best thing they could have done, because he wouldn't have fit necessarily into this film. It's his death that has caused the development of these characters, and with him still being there, these events couldn't really take place in the same manner. And so what you have also is the neighbourly character growing, and opening the film on day one is perfect. You couldn't have done that in the first film, because the first film it's all about the fear of the unknown, but in this film now we have the known. What we want to know is the expansion, the answers of how this started, and so the beginning has so much dread, and yet you love it because Krasinski's back. Man, I just love the editing, because it's constantly moving forward, and say for intercutting, for cross-cutting, it makes this family feel connected, even though geographically, they are hundreds upon hundreds of miles apart, and yet they feel interconnected by the utilization of the editing, constantly going between these storylines, making sure there's never a dull moment. The creature designs are fantastic, and that's what creates so much dread about them, but their weaknesses, they have something to exploit. And so, I love the character dynamics. I love how they built upon the first here. The editing is masterclass, and it's a shame it hasn't been nominated for Oscars, because boy, this is a film that deserves to be put on the dissection table, because this shows students how filmmaking should be done. It's a kind of film where, you know, you'd want to go out into your backyard and film it yourself, because it's such a unique twist on this premise. Just horrific creatures, yeah, that's been done before, but these ones hunt using sound. So therefore, A Quiet Place is built. Krasinski puts so much personal flair into the direction of this film. It has uniqueness and style behind it. You watch him break down the beginning scene of the film, and you see, like, he wrote it as kind of like a template for writers to go from further, because originally he wasn't going to direct this, but then after 5 pages he fell in love with his work so much that he was just like, damn, I'm directing this movie, aren't I? So, plus you have the fact that Raya's actress, the character who plays her, she's actually deaf. She's deaf in the film, and the actress is deaf in real life, and she was able to create such beneficial input into the film because of that role, and ultimately, because of that, her family also got to experience a perspective just like her. This brought about cinema unlike we've seen it. This was a kind of experience that cinemas was built for, because the sound too, it's got really loud booms. It makes you fear the booms. It makes you fear any sort of sound, because everything's quiet. And then you hear a rustle. You want to know where it's from. You see where it's from, and then all of a sudden, oh shit, monsters are on the loose. And we don't know whether our character's going to live. Like, the acting makes us believe sort of way, because Raya, she has so much dread in her face when she's on the train car. Oh man, you cringe at it, honestly. And the fact that performances can bring about that level of experience and emotion, that, my friends, is what makes A Quiet Place Part 2 my favourite film of 2021. With that being said and done, this video is coming to an end, and I want to thank you all so much for watching. By merely clicking on this video, you've shown support and helped it garner recognition so it can reach many of the viewers here on YouTube. I'd love to see you take the extra step and leave a like on the video if you enjoyed. Also, be sure to comment below and push that subscribe button whilst you're down there. By clicking elsewhere on screen, you can either check out a video that's specifically picked out for you, or you can check out the rest of the playlist for the series you just watched. Before ending off, I'd like to thank all of my Blazing Knights and Scorching Dragons whose support helped make these videos possible. I'll be seeing you in the next video, and until that moment arises, peace!